We're back, and we're going to start again. In the last lecture, I didn't cover as much as I had planned or as I had scheduled. So I have to finish up some of the material that basically went into that lecture. And what it concerns was the third element of Hamilton's plan for the country. He's trying to make the country economically more prosperous and richer and more productive and so forth. And so he's come up with this plan. There are other things that I didn't get into because I just tried to focus on what I consider the major parts. The thing that I talked about was his plan for tariffs, which is sort of the starting point because that's going to provide the government with money, which is essential. Nothing else works without money. So he's got the tariff, and that's working very well. And it turned out, as I told you, over the long run, tariffs produced a good chunk of the revenue that the federal government received throughout the first century of its history. So that was a success. And then he had his plan for dealing with the debt from the Revolutionary War, and we talked about that. And he's trying to basically restore the credit of the country. You know, given the fact that the country had not paid its debts, its credit was very poor. So he's trying to restore that, and again, he was very successful. Within a couple of years, government bonds, which had been circulated at about half their face value, were running at about 110%, 112% of their face value. So he's got some successful ideas there. And the third component is going to deal with the whole issue of money and banking, which are connected. And the connection, of course, you understand, I've talked about it a little bit, is that banks create money. That's the bottom line. Banks exist. Banks are private corporations. They're in business to make a profit. And the way they make a profit is by making loans and then charging interest on those loans. That's the point of a bank. And where do the banks get the money that they lend out? And the answer is they print it. Each bank just prints its own bank notes, they're sometimes called, paper notes, paper currency, and then they lend it to people and start charging interest. That's the way a bank works. The catch is, of course, that they are allowed to do that only if they have reserves, supposedly in gold, to back up the currency that they're issuing. And the notes that they issue are all redeemable in gold. That is, it says on there that you can present the note to the bank and exchange it for the gold. Now, if everybody does that, of course, the bank is going to fail because it's issued a lot more paper money than it has gold. That's the point. That's why it can increase the money supply. It can take gold and multiply it by issuing paper notes far in excess of the value of the gold. But the assumption is, and this is what banks count on, is that nobody's ever going to do that, or that people will not, at least under normal circumstances, in large numbers, want to redeem their notes. Paper money is a lot easier, it's a lot more convenient, it's a lot safer, and it's preferable to gold in many, many ways. So the assumption is people would rather have the notes than the gold, and as long as people have confidence, as long as people are convinced that the bank can redeem its notes in gold, it won't actually have to. So it's sort of some people say the whole idea is kind of fake, but it works, and it's worked for a long, long time. And it had worked for a long time when Hamilton was alive. So we had not been allowed to have banks when we'd been colonies, as I think I mentioned. That was one of the things that really did restrict us. And what colonies had to do, what the assemblies had to do, was to come up with ways to get around that, come up with gimmicks to have money without having real banks and without having the whole idea of gold reserves or any of the other things that are supposed to have in a banking system. And we didn't have it. Now that we're independent, we're starting to get it. And as I think I told you, most states are now issuing charters to banks. They're setting up private corporations within their state to engage in banking. And the idea is that that way we can have economic growth because the banks can print money, people can borrow money, they can go out and build factories, build ships for trade, do whatever, and bring about the prosperity of the country. That's the idea. The problem is that many states are very, very irregular in how they regulate their banks. Some states do a very good job of it, and other states do almost nothing. I mean, in some states it's almost like, just go ahead and do whatever you want. State regulation of banks is very, very uneven. And that causes real problems for businesses in the country, because there's all of this paper money floating around, and on the one hand you'd like to take it. I mean, you're always interested in money, but you don't know if it's any good. And it's impossible to keep track of everything because there are so many banks and they're all doing different things. The state laws are all very uneven, and it's hard to keep track of what states are requiring of their banks. And so for Hamilton, this is a good reason why he kind of, to himself, he would say, I told you so, I told you so. We should have gotten rid of the states. We should just have one national banking system, one uniform system of money where it's the same in the whole country. And however it's issued, the money should be valid at the same value throughout the whole country. We should have just a single uniform monetary system. And of course he's frustrated because he can't have that because nobody listened to him at Philadelphia, and we've got all these states and they're all doing their own thing, and some of what they're doing is just crazy. So the idea of the Bank of the United States is that, as I started to tell you, on the one hand it's going to be an actual bank. It's what we call a commercial bank. I'll put these terms on the list. It's called a commercial bank in that it's going to be like every other bank. It's going to issue loans. But the point is, of course, it's going to be a solid bank. It's going to have what many state banks don't have. It's going to have adequate gold reserves. And as part of Hamilton's plan, it's also going to be able to have reserves of U.S. government bonds issued by the Treasury Department. But that's okay because those bonds are as good as gold. They're absolutely safe, backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States government, and that amounts to something because the government has money, because it has tariffs, and it's got revenue, and it's solid. It's good. So it can issue credit notes. The Treasury Department can issue bonds that will be totally safe, as good as gold, and so those can be used also to back up the currency of the Bank of the United States. And this is an important thing because for Hamilton, the Bank of the United States is going to act as the bank for the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. government is like anybody else. It needs a bank. It has money coming in. It's got money coming in from the sale of Western lands. That's a big source of revenue for the government in addition to tariffs. So it's got all the money coming in from tariffs. So money is coming into the U.S. government. People are paying the government money either in the form of the tariffs or in the form of payment of purchase of Western land. So the government has to have a bank to put that money. And it also then has to have a bank from which it can issue payments. When the government itself spends money, which it does, when it pays interest on the bonds, when the government pays federal employees, they don't have many of them, but compared to today, but there are people who work for the government. There's soldiers in the army. We don't have much of an army. We really don't want a real big standing army, but we do have a little bit of an army, and those soldiers have to be paid, and so the Treasury Department has to issue them checks. It has to issue them payroll. So the government has expenditures just like anybody, like any other business. And the idea is that the Bank of the United States will handle that. The Bank of the United States will serve as a commercial bank with one of its customers, probably its biggest customer, being the U.S. government itself. And this means that if the government ever needs money, as for instance it had needed it when we were fighting a war, if we ever get into another war and the government has to borrow money, the government can borrow as much money as it wants from the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States will just be able to print as much money as the government needs, and the government is going to pay for it with bonds, with government bonds, which can then be used as the base, as the security for the money. So that the government will print bonds, the bank will put those bonds into its vault as security, and then issue paper money. So it's all going to work well. And it's going to meet the needs of the country in case we have, like I say, another emergency, as would be the main example of another war. And Hamilton was well aware of the need to have good sources of income for the Army, because he'd been sort of the finance manager for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So he's well aware of these problems, and he sees this whole idea as a way to solve that and put the United States government into a sound basis. But the Bank of the United States is going to be able to do something more than just act as a bank with all sorts of all kinds of business customers, with all sorts of private parties as customers, and then with the U.S. government as a customer in a sense. Because of its unique position, it will be able to monitor state banks. People, for instance, who buy land from the federal government usually use state bank notes. That's one of the main reasons why banks issue money. One of the main things that people do with money is to buy land from the federal government. So these state banks issue their notes to people who buy the land and then pay the Treasury with those state banknotes, and the Treasury then deposits those state banknotes in the account that it has at the Bank of the United States. So the Bank of the United States is going to accumulate a lot of the state bank notes that are being issued. They will come into the bank in its role as the bank for the U.S. government. So there's going to be a lot of paper money from state banks coming into the Bank of the United States. And it can monitor that. It can keep track of how much money is coming in from each state bank in the country. And it can look and see if banks around the country are issuing what looks suspiciously like too much paper money. Of course, banks want to issue as much paper money as they can. The more paper money they print, the more loans they can make, the more interest they can make. The problem is, if they make too many loans, they're running the risk of having so much currency out there that maybe people will start trying to redeem it and they won't have enough gold. So the Bank of the United States can sort of act as a regulator of state banks. It can keep track of how much each state bank how much currency each state bank is issuing. And it can look for possible situations where state banks are issuing so much paper money, a lot of that paper money is coming into the vault of the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States looks at how much it's got in its vaults and it says, wait a minute, here's a bank that's got way too much paper money, it probably doesn't have enough gold. And then the Bank of the United States can redeem those notes, and if the bank does not have the gold, as they suspect, the bank is gone. And banks know that. Banks know that if they start issuing too many loans, if they start issuing too much paper money, that paper money, a lot of it is going to just work its way through the normal process of people buying land, doing whatever they do with the loans, and it's going to end up in the vault of the Bank of the United States. And then the Bank of the United States is going to come down with its heavy hand and shut them down. So they have to watch themselves. they have to moderate themselves. They have to be sure that they act in a monetarily responsible way, that they don't just issue paper money crazily. They've got to be careful, and that means that the paper money that they issue is going to be sound. It's going to be carefully backed up by whatever they have, gold, or sometimes they use other things, but whatever they use, that there's enough security for the paper money that it's going to be good. And businesses throughout the country can be assured that the paper money that comes to them is being watched by the Bank of the United States. If the money is out there, that means that the Bank of the United States has decided that it's okay, it's safe, so they can take it. And that's Hamilton's plan, to have a system of banks in this country, each of which is regulated by state law, and state laws are, who knows, who cares? I mean, it won't matter what the states do, if they do a good job or not, because the Bank of the United States is going to exercise real control, real regulation of the state banks, even though some state legislatures don't do anything. Some state legislatures are just crazy, especially in the West and the South. They just say, oh, hey, we need money, print it, don't care. But the Bank of the United States won't allow that. So that's what Hamilton wants, to have a Bank of the United States that maintains satisfactory, uniform standards of money throughout the whole country, regardless of whether the state does a job or not. The Bank of the United States is going to establish regulations that ensure that the money is good. So I'm trying to make the case here that this is really a sound thing. It's really a good idea. But in Congress, people like Madison and other Republicans, and by this time the opponents of Hamilton have really sort of come together, and they're acting as a political party, and they're calling themselves Republicans, and they raise an objection. The objection is the Bank of the United States constitutional? You look at the Constitution of the United States, and it doesn't say anything at all about issuing charters. The Constitution spells out, in Article 8 of Section 1, it spells out all of the powers that Congress has. And I think it goes out, they're lettered, and sometimes so they go to like P or whatever it is, however many letters that is, it's 18 or 7 or what, I don't know, I forget the number. I don't know the number because they don't number them. But there's all of these subclauses of Article 1, Section 8, that says what Congress can do. You know, it can issue, it can borrow money, it can establish an army, it can establish a uniform system, weights and measures, it can issue patents, it can do all sorts of things. But nowhere does it say anything about issuing a charter to a corporation. And it says nothing about banks or any of that stuff. So Madison, on the floor of Congress, argues that Congress can do only those things that are specifically assigned to it. So this is a system that says Congress can do only those things that are actually mentioned in the Constitution. They insist on interpreting the Constitution strictly, exactly. Sometimes this whole concept is called strict construction. The term is strict construction. That means you have to construe the Constitution strictly, that it has to be construed literally, exactly the words that it says. And if it doesn't say something that Congress can do, then it can't. So the Republicans are arguing that the bank is unconstitutional because Congress does not have the power to issue a charter because it's not in the Constitution. Read the Constitution. There's nothing in there about that. So that means Congress can't do it. So there's strict construction opposition to the bank. Well, Hamilton replies to that. Hamilton says, he can't argue that the Constitution specifically allows it, because all you have to do is read the Constitution, and there it is. There's nothing in there about charters or corporations or banks or anything. But Hamilton argues that the Constitution contains implied powers, that there are many things that it doesn't say that Congress can do it, but it's implied. It's implied. And for instance, in the case of a bank, the Constitution says Congress can borrow money. That's one of the powers that is mentioned in the Constitution. That Congress has the power to borrow money. It says that in so many words. Well, that means it's got to have money, be able to borrow money from somebody. If it can borrow money, that means that there has to be a bank from which it can borrow money. So it's implied that Congress can establish a bank, and that's one of the main things that Hamilton wants the bank to be able to do, to lend money to Congress. So Congress doesn't have to go scrounging around like it had during the Revolution. It can just borrow money from the Bank of the United States. But it has to be a bank, so it's implied that it's there. The Constitution spells out ways that Congress can impose taxes. Well, that means it's going to get money. It's got to do something with the money that it gets from taxes. There has to be a bank somewhere for it to deposit the money into, so that implies that Congress can establish a bank. And specifically what Hamilton can point to is within Article 1, Section 8, the last one, the last of the things that it says, which is like I say P or something, I forget. But that says Congress, I sort of have to improvise a little bit here because I can't remember the exact words, but the effect of it is Congress may do all things that are necessary and proper to do the things that are listed in the first item, all of that, the first part of that section. This is like number 17. There's 16 things that Congress can do, and then number 17 is it can do all things necessary and proper to do the first 16 things. So that phrase is, those are the exact words, necessary and proper. That's what Hamilton argues. The Constitution gives Congress powers to be necessary and proper. So there's a big debate in Congress, and when the dust has settled, Hamilton and the Federalists win. They have a majority in Congress. And so Congress did pass the law chartering the Bank of the United States. Hamilton and his side won. They got the majority. They have the most votes. And so the Republicans lost the debate. Well, the matter went then to President Washington. Remember, Congress has passed a bill. Now the president has to sign it to make it a law. And Washington, of course, knew what was going on in Congress. Congress does not meet in secret. Washington does not go to Congress. He's not a member. He's not allowed to go there. But he certainly knows what's going on. It's a matter of public record. And he knows that there's been a good deal of objection to this bank. And he takes that seriously. He wants to be sure that he does the right thing. So he asked his cabinet for their advice. He wanted to get them to give him some recommendations as to whether he should sign this or not. And he got recommendations from both Jefferson and Madison, two members of his cabinet, who are, as I said, technically colleagues, although they're on real opposite sides politically. And Jefferson, as you can imagine, said, "No, Mr. President, the law is unconstitutional. You should veto it." And this is consistent with Jefferson's whole philosophy of a republic. He wants, within the whole concept of the United States, to have states have ultimate power. We saw that in his authorship of the Kentucky Resolves, where he had argued that Congress had no power to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts, that was a violation of of the Constitution. And he just in general is an advocate of greater power at the state level. He wants a limited federal government. And the way you limit the power of the federal government is you require it to obey only the laws, only the provisions that are explicitly in the Constitution. Strict construction. Strict construction means a limited federal government, more power to state governments. And of course his idea is that each state should regulate its banks, and that it should be up to states to decide what to do about banks within their state. He doesn't trust a strong federal government. And this is consistent with his idea that I told you about a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of lectures ago, about his reason why Virginia should cede that land to the federal government. We don't want big states. We don't want big governments. We don't want big, powerful governments. We want power to be diffuse. We want power to be distributed among smaller units of government. And in terms of the Constitution, that means the states, that we should put great emphasis on states as smaller units and not on the one big federal government. One big federal government is, in Jefferson's way of thinking, a threat to liberty, a threat to the freedom that's so important to Americans. You don't want big federal governments. Keep power diverse among each state. And that means veto the Bank of the United States. Let each state handle its own banks. Don't have a big national government. And don't let the federal government sort of have a blank check for doing whatever they want. You know, that they can just say, well, everything is implied, everything is necessary and proper, and we do whatever anything. That's a danger. That to him is a step towards tyranny. Well, Hamilton replied that we need a strong federal government. I mean, Hamilton has always been an advocate of a strong federal government. He's always been an advocate of a single nation. As I told you, in his best scenario, which of course he's given up on, he knows he's never going to get this, but we wouldn't even have states. And this whole thing about with the chaos of finance shows the need for a strong federal government to oversee banking. And so, in contrast to Jefferson and the Republicans with their idea of state rights, state sovereignty, Hamilton we can call a nationalist. He is in favor of a strong national government. And he says that, you know, as far as protecting our freedom, that's why we have a system of checks and balances. It's written into the Constitution that there can't be any tyranny through the very structure of the Constitution, and that there's no risk to freedom from having Congress establish this bank. Well, Washington looked these over, and he decided to go with Hamilton. He signed the law. The bank went into business. The bank started. Washington, as I've told you, really did not like the idea of political parties. He really disliked what he saw as partisanship. He was very discouraged that within a few years the idea of having the United States as a sort of a non-political nation, that's gone. The country's badly divided between the Federalists and the Republicans. In 1796, he retired. He stepped down, and was discouraged that there was this big, huge battle between the Federalists and the Republicans for presidency. It's kind of complicated how it came out, because it's Adams for the Federalists and Jefferson for the Republicans, and the Constitution was different. And it takes a long time to explain it, and I don't want to get into it, but it turned out it was kind of weird that Adams won, so he became president. Jefferson came in second, so he became vice president. So those two were, it was kind of an awkward time during during the Adams administration, starting in 1797, because the vice president, who was a good friend of his, but they were political opponents, and they really didn't get along. That was a kind of a tense time in their relationship. Their friendship was greatly strained by the fact that although they'd known each other for many years and had worked together during the Revolution and so forth, they're on opposite sides of the political fence, and they had a hard time maintaining their friendship during the Adams administration. And in 1800, it's the same thing again. Adams versus Jefferson. This time Jefferson won, but it was really hard because it was a tie between him and his own vice presidential candidate. How that worked out, we had to change the Constitution because that was an impossible situation, and so the country's badly divided, and there's intense political arguments. If you look at the arguments of the politicians in 1800, oh my God, the Republicans are warning that if Adams is elected, he's going to make himself into a king. He's trying to establish a monarchy. The Federalists argue that if Jefferson wins, he's going to establish a atheist society. Jefferson was not technically a practicing Christian, and so he got attacked for being an atheist, and he's going to bring atheism to the country. And he had also been sort of favorable to the French Revolution, and he's going to be then an advocate of a revolution, and there's going to be bloodshed in the streets the way there was in Paris. And they're just threatening each other with all these terrible things and saying terrible things about each other. And actually by 1800, Washington had died, but even before his death, he was just appalled that the country had descended into such intense partisanship, and he wanted to stay above it. But the fact was, he really did favor the Republicans. The Federalists. He favored the Federalists, and he blamed the Republicans for all of the reasons why there's so much partisanship in the country. And that's not really fair, because it's both sides. Both the Republicans and the Federalists, they went at each other. They were just as nasty as each other, as one another. But Washington for some reason, he just got it into his head that it was the fault of the Republicans, which meant that he was kind of estranged in his last year or so when he's retired and he's living at home. He really was upset with Jefferson, and he kind of blamed Jefferson for all these problems, which, these are two guys who had been, together in the Revolution, and their friendship and their partnership to work for independence. They're both key in the fight for independence, and now they're sort of estranged. They don't really get along, and so sometimes you'll see Washington identified as nonpartisan. Other times you'll see him identified as a Federalist, because he really did. He signed the bill. He generally favored the Federalists, and took the side of the Federalists on most issues, even though he would say he was nonpartisan, but he really was sort of. And he tried to be nonpartisan, and he tried to be above politics, but he did favor the Federalists. But the election of 1800 was a victory for the Republicans, and it was a definite victory for the Republicans, and it was really a rejection of federalism. The Federalists had been the majority party during the Washington administration. They were still the majority party during the Adams administration, but they became the minority party, and they never regained power. The Federalists kind of suffered from an idea that they're just obsessed with warning against the people. We always need this strong government to protect us against mobs and everything like that. They really hit on that, and everybody sort of did, but the Federalists really made a point of it, and they really stressed that, and it made it look like they really are objecting to the people. Well, who are the voters? The people. So they kind of alienated a lot of voters, and they lost power, and they never regained it. So from 1801 on, we're dealing only with Republican majorities, with President Jefferson elected in 1800, re-elected in 1804, and then followed by Madison in 1808, and he was re-elected in 1812. And then in 1816, we're getting ahead of the story here a little bit, but in 1816 it's time for the next sort of Republican from Virginia, James Monroe, to take over, and he was re-elected. He was elected, excuse me, he's elected in 1816 and re-elected in 1820, and we'll get to his administration eventually. But it's, you know, 3 Republicans from Virginia, each of whom served 2 terms, so there's 24 years there, or 24 years of Republican rule, and the Federalist Party is just going to go away. And we'll maybe get back to that a little bit. We're going to talk about this about the Republican administration. Let me talk first of all about Jefferson's foreign policy. Jefferson became president at a time when the foreign relations of the United States were in good shape. The Federalists under Washington and Adams, with the Jay's Treaty, with Pinckney's Treaty, with the resolution of the XYZ affair peacefully, the Federalists had restored good relations for the United States, so Jefferson inherited a very favorable foreign policy situation. And then shortly after he became president, it became even better because during the 1790s, England and France had been at war. That was tough for the United States to be, we were sort of like, we wanted to be neutral, we wanted to stay out of that war. Washington made strong efforts to keep the United States neutral while France and England were at war. But it was kind of hard because both France and England wanted the United States to come in on their side. Both of them would try to stop us from trading with their enemy. Both the French Navy and the English Navy were seizing American ships engaged in trade as a way of denying our trade to their enemy. So it was kind of tough for the United States to be in the middle. We don't want to have anything to do with this war, but both sides are kind of beating on us, trying to get us into the war on their side. But then in 1801, shortly after becoming president, they signed a treaty and ended the war. So that's even better. Now we can trade with both sides without having to worry about them being at war and not wanting us to trade with each other. So that was a plus, and so Jefferson's got a really good foreign policy situation. It didn't last long, unfortunately, for Jefferson. Within a couple of years, France was taken over by Napoleon, and Napoleon ended the Republic. France had been a republic ever since 1789 in the French Revolution, where they'd executed their king, and they'd established a republic, and that was why England was fighting against them during the 1790s. England didn't want France to be a republic, so they were trying to restore monarchy to France, and they never did, but instead Napoleon took power in France and established himself as emperor. And he's out for power. And one of his first targets is to get some territory from Spain. Now, I've tried to minimize the talk about some of the things going on in European politics, but if you remember, by the Treaty of 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, France lost all of its empire on the mainland of North America. And they'd had the largest empire in at least north of the Rio Grande and in what is now the United States and Canada. France had this, most of that was French, but they lost it all. Everything east of the Mississippi went to England and eventually became part of the United States. Everything west of the Mississippi became part of Spain. So Spain had had that territory for about 40 years. And in 1802, Napoleon got it back. How he did that is a long story, and it has to do with European politics. I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get too much off the topic here of U.S. history. But Napoleon basically pressured Spain into returning to him, to France, the territory that it had lost as a result of its losing in the 7 Years' War. So Napoleon has reacquired all of that territory out there, which for want of a better word we'll call the Louisiana Territory. It excludes the modern day state of Louisiana, but it extends all the way up through the middle of America, all the way out to the Rocky Mountains and maybe over to the Pacific coast. We don't even know. I mean, it's not clear as to who some of that territory is, how much of that is included in this territory, because it was never clearly defined. But they have a vast territory that now is back under French control. And, on the one hand, that doesn't concern the United States. But that includes the port of New Orleans, which I've mentioned several times in this class as of vital importance to the United States, because that's the key to our settlement of the West. We can't settle the West, we can't settle that area west of the Appalachians unless we have access to the port of New Orleans. We have to be able to send our agricultural product that we're going to be growing in the Ohio Valley and wherever in that area west of the Appalachians. We're going to have to be able to send it down rivers or up rivers to the Ohio River. The Ohio River runs into the Mississippi. The Mississippi goes down to the Gulf of Mexico, but it goes through the port of New Orleans. So we need to have access to the port of New Orleans. And we had gained that, if you remember, back in 1795 with Pinckney's Treaty with Spain. That was one of the great successes of the Federalist presidencies, to get American access to New Orleans. But now the question is, if France is going to take that over, France is going to regain control of New Orleans. It had been a French city. This name is French. It had been a French city from the early 1700s down until 1763. Now it's going to be back under French control. And nobody knows what's going on here. Nobody knows what France intends to do with that territory. Nobody, as a matter of fact, for some time, nobody even knew that officially it had been transferred, because the transfer was done by a secret agreement between France and Spain, and nobody was talking about it. There were all sorts of rumors, but we don't know the details, and we don't know what that means for New Orleans. And we don't care about this other area about over west of the Mississippi. That's who cares whether it's France or Spain, but we care a lot about New Orleans. So Jefferson said, we've got to be sure we get to use New Orleans, that somehow in this deal between France and Spain, and what it amounts to is that Pinckney's Treaty will still prevail, that France will respect, even though the treaty is with Spain, but that doesn't mean France can't decide to just respect it and continue to use it. But we don't know if they will. And we don't know what's going on. And it's really important to us. For Jefferson, this is one of the most important issues, because we have to have access to New Orleans if we're going to continue. We're starting to settle that area out in the west. We've been doing that. Americans are flooding west of the mountains, taking advantage of the opportunities to trade down through New Orleans. We've got to keep that going. If suddenly if France tells us we're not going to let you use New Orleans, there's a lot of people out there in the West are going to be dead. Their farms are going to be worthless because they won't be able to dispose of their product, of their harvest. So Jefferson sent some negotiators to Paris. James Monroe, who was his junior follower from Virginia, and the regular ambassador Livingston. And he says, see if you can get a deal with Napoleon to make sure that we'll continue to use New Orleans. If necessary, offer to buy it from him. We'll buy just the city of New Orleans. There's a little bit of territory there that's actually east of the river. New Orleans is on the east bank of the Mississippi, and there's a little territory around it. It's kind of a mess because it's all very swampy, and there's a big, huge lake there, and it's part of the delta of the Mississippi River, which sort of changes every year. The Mississippi is notorious for flooding and causing damage, and a lot of people would say you shouldn't build a city at New Orleans because it's sort of in this swampy area where the river changes all the time and it can flood, and it's very unstable. Just buy that territory, and that way we would get to be able to use the port of New Orleans. So Monroe and Livingston start negotiating with France, and at a certain point, to their surprise, France says, well, we'll sell you the city of New Orleans, but let's make it all of the Louisiana Territory. We'll make the whole thing American territory. And we're a little unclear as to why, Napoleon just got this from Spain, and he went to some trouble. It wasn't too hard because he just banged on Spain's door a little bit and said nasty things to him, and Spain, okay, don't get mad, and gave him that whole Louisiana territory. But he'd gone to some trouble to get it, and then all of a sudden he's turning around and he's trying to sell it to the United States. And some people think, and I've seen different things about this, and I'm not sure what the truth is, but the latest theory that I read just a couple days ago was that Napoleon never really wanted Louisiana. He had just wanted to keep it out of England's hands. He got it from Spain because he was afraid that if he didn't get it, then England would, and he didn't want England to have it. So he was perfectly willing to sell it to the United States. So here is this great offer. The price was very low. It came out to be just a couple cents per acre, and at that time, the United States government is selling land west of the Appalachians, the land that we have. We're selling it to the farmers who are settling there for like $1 an acre, and now all of a sudden we can buy this whole vast territory for 3 or 4 cents an acre. Is that a good deal where you buy something and you pay 3 cents an acre and then you can sell it for $1 an acre? It's a great deal. Doubles the size of the country. So it's a great deal, and Monroe and Livingston, they sent the news back to Jefferson. They were excited. They said, this is a great opportunity we've gotten here. And Jefferson said, oh yeah, I agree, it's a good deal, Get all that land, that's good. There's only one problem. It's not constitutional. And I've told you today that he's an advocate of strict construction of the Constitution. He was an advocate of strong state superiority to the federal government in writing the Kentucky Resolve back in the days of the XYZ affair and the so-called quasi-war with France. He's on record as opposing the idea of a federal government that has a lot of power and has all sorts of discretion as to what it's going to do. So he says, we can't do it. It's unconstitutional. But he said, now there is an option here. We can amend the Constitution. But his argument is, we have to amend the Constitution to allow Congress, to allow the government to make this massive purchase that will double the size of the country. It'd be okay to buy a small territory. That's not a big issue because the federal government can own little pieces of property here and there. But it can't just acquire a vast territory because the Constitution doesn't allow it. Strict construction of the Constitution. So the whole idea of buying Louisiana contradicts Jefferson's constitutional theory of strict construction. Can't do it. But we can amend the Constitution. But Monroe and Livingston write back and say, sir, that could take years. Sometimes amending the Constitution has to go through this whole process. It could take years, and we can't count on, we're dealing here with Napoleon. Napoleon has just sort of, on a spur of the moment or whatever, decided to sell it to us. He just acquired it, and now he's turned around and he's going to sell it to us. he can change his mind again. We can't wait. We got to do it. You know, this is an offer, and it's only going to be good for a little while. You got to buy it now. So Jefferson said, what? It's against his view of the Constitution? He said, what? Okay. Got to do it. Well, you know, I bring this up because I'm going to ask you to think about this a little bit and evaluate what you think about Thomas Jefferson. Because it relates to a larger question of not just so much what you think about Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, but what you think about the whole concept of the role of the president in American life. Do we want a president who has principles, who believes in strict construction, he believes in limited federal government, he believes in states' rights, so we expect him to come in and do that as president. He's elected on the basis of being an advocate of strict construction, states' rights, and limited federal authority. And we expect him to do that. But on the other side, we want a president who's willing to say, and I'm asking, I'm not trying to say that this is what you should think. I just want you to decide for yourself what you think. Do we want a president who also says, well, you know, I believe in strict construction, but I think in this case, it's going to harm the country. And what I really want to do is help the country. So I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to say that I was wrong, and I'm going to adopt, at least in this case, a more expansive view of the Constitution. I'm going to sort of say that it's sort of implied. I'm going to let the implied powers doctrine apply in this case, and we're going to go ahead and buy it. And his position was, you know, there's going to be an election in 4 years or 3 years now. Well, it's down, but this is by this time it's 1803. There's going to be an election next year, and if the American people don't approve of what I did, they'll vote me out. He said, but I know they won't, and they didn't. You know, and in fact, the purchase, while there were some left, there were still some remnants of the Federalist Party. I mean, certainly there were a lot of Federalists still around. The party was no longer in a majority, was no longer in power, but there were still a lot of people who were Federalists, and they opposed this. But basically, it was a very popular action, and we went ahead with it. But you know, the question here is still: do we want a strong federal government with a great deal of flexibility, a lot of implied powers that is able to do a lot of different things? And that means then that we want a government with a single nation. We want the United States to be a single nation and able to do these things. Or do we want states' rights, strict limitations on the power of the federal government? And the states' rights document is based on the idea that we're a federation of states, with each state being sovereign, each state running its own affairs. Is that what we want? Is that what we are? Are we a federation of states? And we can see that although, you know, Jefferson ended up going from one side of this argument to the other in this issue, that the issue is still very much there, and it's still very much unresolved, and it's going to come back to haunt us again at some time in the future. Well, the deal went through. It's turned out the United States government had to borrow a lot of money from some British bankers to carry it out. Nobody in the United States could afford the amount of money involved, and I've just been reading about the deal. It's pretty complicated, and it was sort of a crazy deal, but it got done, and you can read about that, and then of course you can read about Lewis and Clark hired by Jefferson to go out and explore that territory, and that's a big issue, but a big success for Jefferson and the Republican administration. But we did get money to Napoleon, and people who look at this say one of the reasons why he wanted to sell it was because he needed money. And he needed money because he's planning to go back to war against England. I mean, they had just made, just a couple of years before, they had signed a big treaty to end the war that had gone on through most of the 1790s between England and France. And so they've only had a couple of years of peace between wars, and now Napoleon wants to go back at it. And he's planning to launch a big war against England, and he's going to need money for that, so he's going to sell Louisiana to raise some money. That's part of, I guess, the story. That's why Napoleon decided that after getting Louisiana, and then he's going to turn around and sell it to the United States, and the answer is he needs money. And so once again, as of 1804, 1803, 1804, England and France are at war. And again, this causes real problems for the United States, because our goal is to remain neutral. I mean, that's what we want. We don't want to get involved in European politics. That's why we wanted to get out of that treaty with France, the Treaty of 1778. That's why we had the whole XYZ affair, because we don't want to get involved in European politics. We want to remain neutral, and we want to be able to trade with everybody. So England and France are at war. We want to trade with both of them. I mean, that's the whole reason of being neutral, is so that you can just trade with everybody. I mean, that's what we want. And yet both England and France recognize that trade with the United States is very valuable. It's very valuable to their enemy. Both of them try to prevent us from trading with the other side. I mean, it's a big part of their whole military strategy, given the importance of American trade. And one of their big goals is to get the United States to stop trading with the other side. So once again, the United States finds itself in the middle of a war that we don't want to have anything to do with. But we're right there, and both sides are sort of beating on us, and we don't want to have anything to do with either of them. But we want to have something to do with both of them, and that's really tough for us. So that's where we'll start in our next lecture. Now, as the question for today's lecture, I will ask you, in his argument about the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States to President Washington, what was the basis of Jefferson's argument? What did he argue to President Washington about the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States?